Music. Well, good afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining us, both here in the room and on the live stream. And on behalf of the School of International and Public Affairs, we want to welcome you to the inaugural Dialogue Across Difference event series. As a new university-wide initiative, this series provides our community with a vital forum to come together, hold difficult yet meaningful conversations, and model civil discourse for our students and ourselves on today's most pressing policy challenges. In that spirit, we are here to discuss the history and future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has deeply impacted so many here and, of course, around the world. We need to begin thinking about how this war will end, what comes next, what does a post-war environment look like, what is the future of those who are involved on all sides, and what does this conflict mean for wider peace in the Arab world and the greater Middle East. To help us consider these tough questions, we have the great fortune of being joined by two experts involved in previous rounds of the Middle East peace process. They'll share their insights, experiences, and help bring context to the ongoing conflict in the region and what lies ahead. Ghaith al-Omari is the Rosalinde and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Senior Fellow in the Washington Institute's Irwin Levy Family Program on the U.S. Israel Strategic Relationship. He is also the former executive director of the American Task Force on Palestine. He served as an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during the 1991-2001 permanent status talks, and in addition has held various other positions within the Palestinian Authority. Dennis Ross is the William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He's advised several presidents on both sides of the aisle in posts across our foreign policy apparatus. I myself had the pleasure of working with him when I was Secretary of State. Ghaith and Dennis are joined on stage by Laura Secor, international editor for The Atlantic, who has reported from and on the Middle East for The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, and many other publications. Please join me in giving our panelists a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Secretary Clinton, for that generous introduction, and many thanks to Columbia University and SEPA for hosting this event, and to our distinguished guests, as well as our audience, both in this room and on live stream, for joining us. The latest acute phase of Middle East conflict that began on October 7th, 2023, is now in its fourth month. Much has been written and said about the conduct of the war, its origins, and the competing claims that underlie it. But perhaps the most urgent question before us is how it will end. Is it even possible at this stage to conceive of and execute a negotiated solution that could secure a lasting peace for both peoples and at last stanch the human suffering in the lands on which they reside? We're really fortunate to have with us today two speakers who have been intimately involved in past negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians. The focus of our conversation with them will be on diplomacy, the peace process, past, present, and future. We'll talk about what has been tried, why past diplomatic efforts have floundered, and how today's negotiators can move this process forward. I'll be asking our panelists questions for about 40 minutes on this theme, and after that, we will have time to engage some questions from the audience. I'll ask you also to make your inquiries relevant to the scope of our discussion. I want to start by asking both of our panelists to describe for us the state of the peace process as it was on October 6th, before this latest round of conflict began. Where were we? How did the prospects look from Gaza or from the point of view of the Palestinian Authority on October 6th? What about within the Israel of Benjamin Netanyahu? And what did the prospect of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia promise to change about this state of play? I'm going to put that question first to Ghaith.
Right. Well, actually, thank you, first of all. Thank you, Secretary Clinton, Karen, Sipa, and Laura for this, and thank you all for being here. That's a very easy question. The answer is simple. The peace process was non-existent on October 6th. It was non-existent for a number of reasons. You know, there's diplomacy fatigue, there was other priorities in the region, etc. But I think a big reason for it was the domestic politics in Israel and among the Palestinians. I will not talk much about Israel, but a bit on the Palestinian side. You have had not only the obvious, the division between Hamas and Fatah, and the kind of paralysis that created, but deeper than that, you had a chronic lack of legitimacy for Palestinian political and governance institutions. We've had, if you look at polls at that point, most Palestinians did not support the two-state solution, yet had no alternative. Did not support Hamas nor Fatah. Did not support armed resistance and violence and terrorism, nor did they support. So they had a complete vacuum. Both related to the failure of diplomacy, but also to poor governance, corruption, etc. So this is where it was there, and with this kind of political reality, it's hard to talk about diplomacy. If you go to the Saudi and the regional, I think while the Saudis did want to include a Palestinian component in their talks with Israel, or through the United States, I do believe there was a general regional sense that the Palestinian issue is containable. So what we're talking about was things that were basically maybe as an add-on to what was going to be the deal. I think what we saw after October 7th, and we'll talk about this later, is a realization throughout the region that this is an issue that still has the ability to mobilize and disrupt the whole region.
So I'll pick it up on the Israeli side, and let me also thank you, Secretary Clinton and Karen, for having us. Ghaith and I actually have been having these discussions for about 25 years, so you're going to be tuning in on what we do on almost a daily basis, and oftentimes we don't care if anybody's here or not, so we're happy you are here, but we will engage in this anyway. What's interesting is if you looked at what was going on in Israel, you had the most extreme Israeli government in its history, a combination of ultra-religious on the one hand, but extreme right-wing fringe ministers on the other. People like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich really followed the tradition of Meir Kahane. To give you a perspective on who he was, Yitzhak Shamir, who was a Likud right-wing prime minister, whenever Kahane would actually enter the Knesset, he would leave. These people were seen as being part of a political fringe. Now suddenly they were put in strong institutional positions. One was the Minister of National Security, a newly formed position. The other was both the Minister of Finance, but he had a ministerial rank within the Defense Ministry. So this was not a government that could do anything with the Palestinians other than probably extend settlement activity in a way that was designed to ensure there could never be a Palestinian state. So we have that element within Israel that is running parallel to what Ghaith was describing with regard to the Palestinians. But you did have something else going on, and he also was referring to this. That was there was clearly a Saudi interest in normalization with Israel because this was the way to get a defense treaty with the United States. It is interesting, by the way, when I say that, oftentimes when you travel in the Middle East, you'll hear almost everybody you talk to will say, well, the U.S. isn't reliable, no one can trust the U.S. Kind of interesting that in a context where people say no one can trust the U.S., what is it that the Saudis wanted and actually still want? A defense treaty with the United States, which suggests that whatever people are saying, their actual view of reality is different. Now, there was something else going on here, and Ghaith, I think, put his finger on it. There was a perception in much of the Arab world that nothing was going to happen on the Palestinian front, partly because they looked at the Palestinians and said they're not capable of helping themselves, and partly because they looked at the Israelis and said, this is an Israeli government, no way can this Israeli government do anything. And yet they didn't want to deny themselves what they feel they need. I think one of the understudied areas has been, what was the effect of the so-called Arab Spring in 2011? I mean, it ended up being moribund. It ended up producing maybe an Islamic winter. But I think what it overlooks is that there were a lot of leading governments or regimes in the region that became more mindful that if you can't engage in decent governance, you could end up having a problem with your public. And if the public gets frustrated enough, they'll lose their fear. And that's what 2011 was. 2011 was a manifestation of Arab publics losing their fear. So the sense that we need to be able to have decent governance, and we need to be in a position where we can cope with the challenges of the 21st century. I mean, climate change in the Middle East, quite real. Droughts, quite profound. Water problems, food problems, then the issue of pandemics, the issue of cybersecurity. And when these Arab states looked around the region and said, who can help us here? They looked at the Israelis. It wasn't just, people tend to ignore that there was an attraction of Israel to many of the Gulf states in particular, not simply because they both shared the same fear or threat perception of Iran, but it was also because they had the sense, well, who can help us when it comes to water security, health security, food security, cybersecurity? These were much more geared towards governance kinds of questions, and they saw Israel as kind of a natural partner. That's really where the Abraham Accords came from. So the Saudis increasingly began to look at this too and think, okay, we have something to gain, but they wanted to get something from the United States at the same time. And the Palestinians were seen as, okay, you can do something symbolic for them, but you don't have to do anything really for them. Now there's a recognition, okay, this is not an issue that you can ignore. So October 7th, by the way, I'll just say this now, and we'll obviously have a chance to get more into it. Israel today is a different country than it was on October 6th. We can get into the reasons for that. And that means, from their standpoint, at least the body politic is more fearful of the Palestinians and fearful of the Palestinian state being run by Hamas-type groups. But they're also more mindful of what they're facing in terms of an Iran threat because it's not just a nuclear issue.
So I think before we get there, I want to turn the page back even a little bit further. So we're looking at a situation on October 6th where, as Ghaith said, there is no peace process that's actually moving forward. How did we get there? What went wrong in the decades prior that led to a situation as you have both just described?
Difficult question to answer in 5 minutes or less. Look, I mean, I would argue a number of issues. I mean, there are some mistakes that we made which was natural. I mean, this was a new process, et cetera, and there was a lot of trial and error. I think there were, by the way, some positive developments as well. And, we'll tend to look at the negative, but as I look back at it, actually, as a negotiator, we have managed to achieve a common objective for the negotiations, agree on the idea of a two-state solution, which is an idea that I believe is one that is very deeply rooted in the kind of aspirations of both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people. This was reflected, etc. But I think, and of course, there's no doubt that the issues themselves were very complicated. I mean, think of something like Jerusalem, so fundamental to both Jewish identity and Muslim identity, not to talk about Palestinian and Israeli identity, even beyond that, refugees, etc. But I think one of the biggest mistakes that we have made is that we've looked at the peace process simply as a diplomatic process. And of course, that's a very important component. Yet what we neglected is that it has to be rooted in reality on the ground, both the political reality on the ground and the physical reality on the ground. And I think in some ways I look back and, Israel has many, many issues and we can talk about them. But as I look back at us as a former Palestinian negotiator, sometimes I would ask myself, were we ready had we had a peace deal for statehood? Our institutions were weak, our political legitimacy was weak. So I think focusing simply on the diplomacy and ignoring the reality ultimately leads to failure, no matter how much, because as negotiators, we can make progress in the issues, but ultimately politicians and leaders have to make the decisions, and if the reality is not conducive, they will not make these kind of decisions. And I think as we look now forward, and I think there's a lot of talking about two-state solution, it is key that we also not only focus on diplomacy, but start focusing on what do you do on the ground to make sure that this diplomacy is rooted in a real thing that can actually work once we get to the moment of decision.
I guess I'd say a number of things. One is, it's true, I think we focus too much top-down and not enough bottom-up. We actually, in the 1995 interim agreement, we had a whole annex called People to People. And I have to admit, as a negotiator, I helped to negotiate that, and then I didn't spend enough time on it. We should have done much more on people to people as a way of humanizing each side to the other side. We see it especially today when each side can't see past their own pain. So number one is we needed to do much more on the ground up, not just the top down. Number two, at those critical moments when we had a chance to make progress, look, we faced acts of terror, and those who carried out the acts of terror did it not because they wanted to promote peace or two states, they wanted to prevent it. And it always strengthened the hand of the extreme. Number three, when we had in 2000, when we came extremely close with the Clinton parameters, and I think Arafat, the Palestinian negotiation was prepared to say yes. Arafat said no, and he would tell people later because he thought he would get a better deal with George W. Bush. That meant we lost a moment. I will just say, as a student of history, when you miss moments, sometimes it's better not to have had them at all, because then the frustrated expectations produces a kind of disproportionate reaction. I think we found all that. So I think this combination of factors probably has contributed to it. Sometimes we shot too high, and we probably should have had our sights lower and prepared the ground the way Ghaith was suggesting. I think one of the things where we ended up, one of the reasons that we were at a point where there was no peace process and yet there was a sense of possibility, within Israel, when you had Prime Minister Netanyahu, he always kind of envisioned that he would prove he could make peace with the Arab states, and then the Palestinians would not have a whole lot of leverage, and he would solve the Palestinian problem as a derivative of the Arab states. That was the appeal, not just of the Abraham Accords, but then also of the possibility of Saudi normalization.
In the past week, we've been hearing a lot about peace proposals that are being floated or discussed among Arab states, the United States, and other actors. I'm curious, the ground does not seem especially promising today compared to perhaps the times in the past when the two of you have been involved. We have a government in Israel that has made its hostility to a two-state solution known, and Hamas is obviously in a similar position. How do we square that circle? Who would be doing the negotiating here, and to what end?
I mean, I actually think that there's a bit of a misperception about this moment. No serious policymaker that I've spoken to, whether in this country or in the region, in the Gulf and elsewhere, believes that a two-state solution is something that is going to happen tomorrow or next week or the week after. I think there is a need for a two-state solution as an objective. Look, I'm a lawyer by training, and I remember in kind of first-year law school, they taught us the importance of legal fictions. And in the same time, in diplomacy, we need sometimes these diplomatic, I don't want to say fiction is maybe too big of a word, but these organizing principles that you know might not be achieved now, but to basically organize how you are going to conduct diplomacy and policy. And so for me, I think for many who are talking about the two-state solution right now is about that. But I think also there's a realization that we need to address all of these kind of shortcomings that I mentioned before we get there. So you talk to, again, Arab officials, they will tell you we do need strong reform of the Palestinian Authority to make it capable. You talk to them and the different decision makers, they will tell you we need to start focusing on achievable steps on the ground that might not be transformative, but at least might rehabilitate the idea that cooperation produces results. So I think there's a degree of wisdom that we basically, yes, we need to be clear and recommit to the end game, but we have to be humble and practical in the way we can do it. And this is the thinking today. Now, I'm always afraid of this kind of the appeal of big diplomacy, because we've seen many administrations come understanding this, but in the end, the idea of having a big international conference is there. And I think part of what we need to do in this country is to almost fight that appeal and understand that we're in it for the long term. And yes, one can argue that the reality is so bad. Yes, the reality is so bad, but a hasty approach will not improve reality, as Dennis said, but will actually raise expectation only to dash them and to leave us in a worse place.
One way I think to sort of deal with this is also to think in terms of October 7th was catastrophic for the Israelis, and the aftermath of October 7th has been catastrophic for Palestinians. And for us to approach this as if there wasn't a catastrophe would almost be a way to guarantee that we'll have more catastrophes. So the first thing is not to build a false set of expectations, but also not to look at this and say it's hopeless. Because if you say it's hopeless, you'll make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we have a responsibility to prevent future such catastrophes. Now, can we do that? Well, what Ghaith is saying, let's approach this and let's be mindful of what's possible, what isn't possible. One key point he's making is the people who are talking about two states or a political horizon are talking about it not because they expect that it's going to be produced next week or next month, but they're saying, look, for us, especially on the Arab side, and this is, by the way, is new. Whenever you're I would say from the standpoint of a practitioner, whenever you're in a situation and you're looking at what makes it difficult, you're also looking, is there anything new in this equation? And there is something new in this equation. There is a sense on the part of many leading Arab states, one, okay, the Palestinians do have to be part of this process, which, as we were saying before, really was not the case before. Two, everyone is more mindful, and by the way, this is not only on the Arab side, but on the Israeli side too, that what the Iranians are doing, first, they can exploit this conflict. They need conflicts to exploit, because on their own, they have no appeal. You know, they talk about themselves being the axis of resistance. They're actually the axis of misery, because every single place where they have influence is a failed state or a failing state or a completely paralyzed state. So if that's the kind of future you want, then you want to sign up to the Iranians. But most of those in the region, they don't want that future. So we now have Gulf states talking about a readiness to play a role in Gaza, in the West Bank, provided there's reform on the Palestinian side, and a readiness to normalize with Israel, but there has to be a Palestinian component. Now, it's true, one of the things you have to reconcile is an Israeli fear today that a Palestinian state will come to be dominated by Hamas and they'll face even more extreme threats than they did on October 7th. With those in the Arab world who say we can't ignore the Palestinians and we need to have a political vision or a political horizon that ends with two states. So we have to look for ways to build bridges. And I don't think it's impossible. On the one hand, you need to build a bridge from where we are in the nature of the conflict now to the day after. I call it the days before the day after. And on the other hand, we need to build a bridge from where we are now to what could be this political horizon that reconciles the Arab need to have a horizon, not a specific endpoint, but a credible horizon of two states with the Israeli fear. And I think there are ways to reconcile that. If you're going to talk about a viable Palestinian state, well, it can't be good. It's not going to be a failed state. It's not going to be a state that's run by Hamas. It's not going to be a state that's going to be part of the axis of resistance. And these are the kind of things that can begin to reassure the Israelis if you have a set of in a sense, realities or conditions or qualifications. But also, on the other side, the Israelis will have to do certain things to make it clear that they're prepared to permit such an outcome. I mean, one of the things that the two of us, I think, have been heavily focused on for a long time, when you had a reformist Palestinian Prime Minister in Salam Fayyad from 2007 to 2012, Israel didn't do the kinds of things it could have done to help him succeed, meaning they didn't have to anoint him. But, you know, to give you just a historical example, in 1994, it's one of the problems when you have people like us. You're going to get lots of examples from the past. 1994, there was something known as the Paris Protocol that was negotiated. It was a customs union that was created between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Now, in a real customs union, the Palestinians should be able to sell their goods within Israel. For the most part, that wasn't permitted. It would have made a big difference if that had been permitted. There were a lot of things that were done in terms of limiting movement for people and goods. Again, that raised the cost to the economy. So there were a series of things that could have been done that would have empowered and validated what Fayyad was doing and shown the payoffs and added to the legitimacy of that approach. And by the way, his approach, if you go back to 2011, you will recall this, he had a plan for creating a Palestinian state in 2 years. Now, what he said within 2 years, what he meant was, I want us to build the institutions in the Palestinian Authority that will make it impossible to deny that we are a state. And he actually said at the time he was taking a page from David Ben-Gurion. He said, what did the Zionists do? The Zionists built from the ground up a state that no one in the end could really deny. That's what he said he was going to do. And this was an area where we collectively, and certainly the Israelis, could have actually made his life much easier and built much more credibility for that.
I'm going to come back in a minute to the question of Palestinian politics and institution building. I wanted to just sort of circle back to a theme that I'm hearing from you, Dennis, about the regionalization of this conflict, that in a sense it's been the sort of first and continuous source of anxiety in the United States, but you're also pointing to something about it that I think you see as hopeful.
I do. I think that what we're seeing with the Gulf states, and it's not just Gulf states, it's also Egypt and Jordan, they collectively understand there is a threat that they're facing. Now the threat, in no small part, is Iran having proxies and exploiting this conflict, and it puts them on the defensive. Obviously, the nature of this conflict, the suffering within Gaza, is putting them on the defensive as well. But they also understand if you don't deal with this, this threat to them isn't going away. But this is a threat that the Israelis can also understand. This is the first time the Israelis have ever faced a six-front war. And that's a function of, again, of Iran's proxies basically promoting this. So you can see a convergence. To be fair to the Biden administration, they're focused, I think, pretty heavily. They're talking about things like regional integration. They're saying, this will include the Israelis. They're not making it up. When the Secretary of State goes and he visits the region, he's hearing it from his counterparts. He's getting pressure to do more to end this war, but he's also hearing from them, look, there are things we are prepared to do we've never done before. This is what we will need on the Palestinian side. Well, part of diplomacy is dealing with circumstances that look to be quite difficult, and then you figure out ways, all right, how do I get around some of these? How do I minimize some of these? How can I create a way to make what seems very difficult more understandable? How can I rationalize behavior? One of the things in negotiations you're always trying to do, you're actually trying to do two things. I wrote a long book on this, and I'm telling you now I can reduce it to 2 points. One, you're giving each side an explanation. They're going to do something that's hard for them. They have to be able to explain why they're doing it and why it makes sense. And related to that is you take away excuses. One of the things you're always dealing with in diplomacy is all the reasons someone can't do something. So you're focusing very heavily on taking away the excuses so that they can.
I think that does bring us back to the Palestinian.
Even before we get this, if I may just kind of 2 points. I mean, one, I really want to amplify the point that Dennis made. We're talking here about the Israel-Gaza war, Israel-Hamas war, whatever. But it's important to zoom out and to realize that this is now becoming a regional issue. We were having actually a discussion a few days ago. I can't remember the last time that we have seen so many active fronts in the Middle East. Everyone's shooting at everyone. The Jordanians are bombing Syria, the Houthis are bombing the Red Sea, etc., and everyone's happening. And as we talk about the bilateral, it's important to look at it also in a regional perspective, because certainly our adversaries are looking at it from a regional perspective. On the hopeful side, I look at slightly different angle, though I reach the same conclusion. Again, betraying my age here, but if you look at Arab politics really in the 20th century, it was always dominated by ideology that is cross-boundary. Pan-Arabism was all about this. Pan-Islamism in its different stripes was about this. What we're seeing right now is a completely different set of politics. We're doing politics that's emerging mainly in the Gulf. The Gulf has finally come to its own post-Arab Spring. They understand that right now the idea of legitimacy is no longer rooted in these big kind of symbolic ideas, but actually in your ability to deliver. You talk to an Emirati official or a Saudi official today, they will ask them, how do you measure success? They will say by personal security, prosperity, stabilization, etc. So this is creating a completely different environment where, the political or the ideological appeal of the Palestinian-Israeli issue might have been reduced, but a new approach based on how do you integrate this as part of a more stable, prosperous region has become the organizing principle here.
So to bring it back to Palestinian politics, obviously that's going to be a crucial piece of any kind of settlement, whether it is local or regional. You have observed, participated in, written about the politics of the Palestinian Authority and of its rivals. What do you see as being the sort of necessary steps that the international community needs to take, or that need to be taken internally, in order to make a viable polity?
Look, I mean, I think the conundrum we have in Palestinian politics is the following. As I mentioned early on, there is absolutely right now no one, no player, no institution, no concept has the kind of public appeal. If you look at public opinion polls, most of the Palestinians will fall in the kind of none of the above categories. Yet we have no tools or mechanisms to actually change this reality, because you have two parties, Hamas and Fatah. Both are very entrenched in power, and the only thing that they agree on is to prevent the emergence of anyone new. You know, Dennis talked about Salam Fayyad, the former prime minister. This is one of the few moments that I saw Hamas and Fatah agree, which is when I need to get rid of this guy because he's presenting something new. The way you deal with this, so while you have a lot of appetite, I think, and you see it in polls, you see it anecdotally, of something new, there is no tool. So then this brings me to the question that you asked, what is the role of the international community? And the role of the international community, I think, is, first of all, let me start by saying what we should not do. We certainly in this country are not very good in micromanaging other people's politics. Think Afghanistan, think Iraq, think many other things. What we are good at, though, is creating standards that we expect to be met and leveraging these standards to create dynamics. And we're good when we want to in building coalitions. And here I go back to the example with the Salam Fayyad. I mean, first of all, anyone who thinks that Fayyad was imposed by Bush, it's a mistake. I know that Fayyad, because I staffed him, for the whole year refused to come to Washington because he said, I will not come until I have an achievement. But what we need to do is to create expectations that will allow someone like Fayyad to come and say, or anyone, a reformer, to come and say, we will only get international support if we do X, Y, and Z. So that's one. Two, we need to build coalitions. Again, when I was an official at that point, I remember sitting in the Oval Office with President Bush. I remember him saying the word reform. Being a polite person, I smiled, nodded, back of my head, yeah, this is going to happen. Then we go to London, Paris, Brussels, and hear the exact talking points. Then we meet with the Saudi foreign minister, who gives us a lecture about the need for, the transparent public finances and a modern constitution, which was very precious from the Saudis at that point. You realize that basically all of the exit ramps have been blocked, and we had no choice. So this is what we need from the international community. Set standards, be serious about them, ensure that anyone who deviates gets a political cost to this deviation. And this is how we start. By the way, with this time, and we'll conclude with this, I think there's a new element that makes me even more positive. In the past, when we were doing reform in the past, most of the kind of technical help we got was from the West. And there was always a degree of kind of a cultural mistranslation, incompatibility, etc. Today, you look at many of the Arab countries, and you feel that there is a chance not only for financial support, but also for technical support. The Jordanians are great with their, public security sector. The Emiratis with the public administration. Saudi's infrastructure. There's so many things that you can bring in. So I would start with this. But the other point, this is about governance. But it's important not to forget politics, because also one thing, and I'm sad to say, that my former boss, President Abbas, has done. He has turned Fatah from a non-democratic yet vibrant political party into one that's much more like the Ba'ath Party, that is very ossified. We need to push for rejuvenation, even if it's not fully democratic, but you need to create a sense for young people that involving in politics, you can make a difference, you can actually get promoted, and that politics is new again. And that requires a certain push on the president himself and an investment of political capital from the outside actors.
And what then about Hamas? Is it possible to have a peace settlement that doesn't include Hamas?
Let me three contradictory points. One, as I look at Hamas, I am not a believer in national unity. I think many new nations get to a point when they're faced with irreconcilable ideas of what the nation would look like. And one has to win. I don't need to go far. Look at this country. We had something we called the Civil War. What the nature of this country? And the two were not compatible. One of the paradigms had to win. Now, just because the paradigm wins, this is my second point, it doesn't mean that the other one's going to disappear. I have in-laws in North Carolina, and I know in some parts of this country the civil war is alive and well. Yet the actor, the winner, defines the rules of the game. What's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And this is actually, I think, what we talk about Hamas. It's a competition. Is the Palestinian state going to be secular or a theocracy? Is it going to be from the river to the sea or a two-state solution? Is it going to be achieved via diplomacy or via terror? And if, one of the reasons why Hamas is so popular is because the alternative was so bad, corrupt, unable to achieve, etc. If we allow the other alternative to deliver in terms of governance, but a point that Dennis mentioned a few times, also Israeli deliverables, which will allow these reformers to say, look, what we're doing is not only making your life nicer, but also a step towards deoccupation. I think this is how you strengthen it. One last kind of maybe technical thing. Well, I'm a strong believer that there's no place for Hamas as an organization in that system, unless Hamas changes and accepts the kind of new rules of the game. It will be a mistake in Gaza in particular to go to a de-Baathification, meaning get rid of anyone who was putting government under Hamas. Many of these people are not hardcore Hamas supporters. Many of these people, to get a job today in Gaza under Hamas, you had to grow a beard or wear a niqab and to get it. So accept that you don't want to create that. And yes, you need to decapitate politically that organization, but you have to give incentive to those who are either soft supporters or people who basically saw no other choice, because you don't want to widen the gulf, you want to create a solid center.
I'm going to turn this sort of spectrum a little bit toward Israel, too. At the beginning of this conflict, there was a great deal of talk about President Biden's personal relationship with Netanyahu, his ability to perhaps influence him by holding him close. And that turned to a good deal of criticism of the Biden administration for not bringing more pressure to bear or more conditionality to that relationship. What do you see as the possible American role in moving the Israeli government toward conditions that would be more amenable to a peace?
Look, I think actually President Biden did what a president has to do with regard to the Israeli public. Presidents who've made a mistake in terms of losing their influence and leverage with Israeli prime ministers have been those who didn't demonstrate to the Israeli public that they understood the predicament that Israel faces. Israel is the only country in the region, aren't too many I can think of internationally, that faces those who say it should not exist, it should be eradicated. So the Israeli body politic starts with the premise that we face threats, and given Jewish history, we know these kind of verbal threats shouldn't be dismissed. What Biden did, President Clinton did, President Reagan did, was create a bond with the Israeli public. And when you create a bond with the Israeli public, it becomes very hard for an Israeli prime minister to say no and have it sustainable. It's very interesting that everyone's focused on the things that Israel hasn't been doing. But I'll tell you something, one thing to bear in mind. Again, Israelis, because of the trauma and the shock of October 7th and the fact that you had hostages kidnapped from the age of 10 months to the years to 85, they have a collective view that Gaza should have been completely cut off until the hostages were released. This is left to right. This is not, because a lot of the victims on October 7th were peaceniks, and they were slaughtered. So there's this view left to right, the hostages are held, this is intolerable, unacceptable. We shouldn't be providing assistance into Gaza, which Hamas in any case is able to divert. Now, the fact of the matter is that's not a sustainable position, but the truth is, with a president who hadn't built a relationship with the Israeli public, you would have seen Netanyahu resist that and not do it at all. So you do have humanitarian assistance going in, not enough, but you have it going in. Kerem Shalom, which is a crossing point from Israel into Gaza, which was closed, and the argument was going to be, no way can we open it, we have to be completely cut off from Gaza. It's open now. There were humanitarian corridors that were created. There were some safe areas that were created. Again, not enough. But given the attitude, the public attitude in Israel, you wouldn't have seen any of this without the pressure from the United States, without the pressure specifically from President Biden. Even ago, last Friday, there's all the stories in the press last week about how Bibi Netanyahu said no to a Palestinian state. Then he has a call with Biden on Friday. And it's pretty clear in that call, he basically began saying things like, Well, you know, there are different kinds of states, you know, states that have some limitations in sovereignty. You know, an example being countries in Europe that have American bases on them, do they not have sovereignty? I mean, states, you can define limitations on sovereignty that are completely consistent with independence and statehood. And it's pretty clear that Netanyahu is adopting a certain public posture because he sees the public's fear of a Palestinian state, but he also understands that he can't just say no to Biden. And if Biden hadn't done the things that he'd done, you wouldn't be in a position where you would have Bibi not feeling the consequence of saying no to Biden. So, you know, would I like to see more done? Absolutely. From the very beginning, I wrote a piece where I said, the Israelis have to demonstrate to Palestinians this is against Hamas and not punishment of Palestinians. They didn't do that. You know, more humanitarian assistance should have gone in from the beginning. Clearly more should have been done, and clearly Biden has been working to try to get more done. Don't underestimate the influence he will continue to have, and I suspect that we will see him apply it.
I was going to ask you again about Saudi Arabia and the role that Saudi Arabia is apparently prepared to play going forward with this, with the peace plans that we're seeing, or the proposals that we're seeing.
Right.
What do you think? It's an interesting. You sort of touched on this earlier, but it's an interesting, or actually I think it was Ghaith who did, moment in Saudi diplomacy. This is a role that we're not used to seeing Saudi Arabia play, and I wondered if you wanted to speak to that a little bit.
Well, I do. I think both of us have kind of touched on. There's a different reality emerging in the region, and it's being driven by a combination of factors. One is fear, which is not unusually, oftentimes a motivating factor. But the other is a sense of, you know, there is a need for change. And it's not just what I was saying before, gee, we have to prevent another catastrophic situation. You look at Saudi Arabia, and you know, the de facto leader is the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. He has a vision for Saudi Arabia, which refers domestically to Vision 2030. The country itself, for anybody who had been there before and they go now, you wouldn't recognize it from the role of women, but also the role of music, the liberalization socially, not politically, democratically, but socially, it's a transformation. Now it's not because he comes to this and that's what he was focused on. He wanted to diversify the economy. He wanted to make them a modern state economically. He wants to make them a focal point internationally, a leader, not just in the region, but internationally across a spectrum of different developments and activities. He wants to make them a data-driven country. And so he understands when you're tied down in conflict, it becomes increasingly hard to do that. So one of the reasons he wants a defense treaty with the United States is he sees this as a kind of ultimate deterrent against threats, which therefore creates the license for him to focus on ensuring that he achieves what he wants to achieve domestically. I think people who don't understand how much of a driver that is for him don't understand what's actually happening in Saudi Arabia, and then it has a set of implications. And one of them is he's open to normalization with Israel because how he sees it fitting into what is his own strategic perception of what Saudi Arabia needs over the coming decades.
Thank you. We're going to open up now to questions from the audience. I'm going to ask that you do phrase your question as a question. And we have time, I think, to take 3. We'll bundle together. And please wait for the mic to come to you.
Oh, thanks. Thank you, Dennis and Ghaith. Good to see you. My question is about the War Cabinet's articulation of multiple strategic aims, which included both a return of the hostages taken on October 7th and also completely eliminating Hamas. From a negotiator's perspective, those seem to be somewhat incompatible. So I guess my question is, you're seeing increasing pressure from families of hostages who were taken on October 7th in the streets, demanding, storming or going into sessions of Knesset and demanding a change in priorities. How do you understand the way that the U.S. and Israel are aligning their strategic thinking about those two objectives? And also, how does that influence what comes after the moment that there is a possible end of fighting in terms of the situation on the ground in a post-conflict governance model?
Thank you. We'll take another question.
Hi. So October 7th obviously was the most deadly attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And if you're Israel, you're not exactly in a position to trust the other side. So my question is kind of twofold. If you're the Palestinian Authority, are you really the negotiating partner on the other side if Hamas has pledged again and again and again that October 7th will repeat itself? And two, if you're Israel, who do you really see as the negotiating partner when it seems that the side on the Palestinian, or the group on the Palestinian side that has the power is Hamas?
Thank you. And one more question, right here.
Okay. In January 2001, the Israelis and Palestinians met in Taba, and they had a series of negotiations, and that was written up by a UN representative. I believe his name was Matanos, and I've read that 15 or 18-page summary, which both sides says is accurate. When I read that, it seems like 99.2% of the issues were resolved. Refugees, status of this, Jerusalem. As a lawyer, too, as you are, I've never seen in a negotiation which agrees on 99.2% of the issues not come to fruition. It's kind of like arguing, do you want to have your co-op closing Tuesday afternoon or Thursday? It really doesn't matter.
So can we come to a question?
Yeah, so the question is, why can't that be built on and get us to an agreement?
Okay. So,
All right, you want me to
for
start?
it.
Okay. Shocked by that. Okay. Look, what that 99.2% reflected was basically a response to the Clinton parameters. And I said the Palestinian negotiating team was prepared to accept it. The Israeli government was prepared to accept it. Arafat was not prepared to accept it. Now, to be fair, the world of 2000 is not the world of 2024. There would have to be certain kinds of adjustments. But the real issue related to what you're asking is, was there the political will to make a decision? And the answer is no. I mean, this conflict, by the way, is a conflict that requires both sides to take on history and mythology. It's harder than the kind of decisions that anybody here will ever have to make. Because it's not easy to take on history and mythology. These are the stories that people have told themselves forever. Israelis, at the end of the day, have to make certain fundamental concessions as it relates, for example, to Jerusalem. Palestinians have to make certain fundamental concessions as it relates to the refugees. These are narrative issues. They go to the heart of self-definition and identity. So it takes political will to, and I would say, create a context where you make it, you create a set of incentives for making these historic decisions, but you also kind of highlight what are the consequences if you don't. Now, we're not close to that right now, given the realities. What we both said, you can talk about a two-state horizon, but there's a lot of work that has to be done to make that credible again. And we're not on the brink of that. That doesn't mean you don't do anything.
Does one of you want to take on the question about the Israeli war aims and the Palestinian interlocutor?
You want to do which one you want?
I mean, I'm going to touch on all of them anyway, so...
All right, so let me take the issue you were raising about the question of sort of the tension between, in a sense, getting all of the hostages released on the one hand and wanting to eliminate Hamas on the other. The first thing is the objective of eliminating Hamas is an impossible objective. It cannot be achieved. That isn't to say that you can't demilitarize Gaza to a point where it cannot be remilitarized. And in the context of creating that demilitarization and planning an international mechanism in the aftermath of it to ensure there can't be rearmament, you will also go through a process where Hamas will not be in control. And part of that will also be tied to a massive reconstruction initiative where you have an international mechanism to make sure the materials that go into Gaza are not diverted for other purposes, and that you're not going to get major investments from the donors to rebuild Gaza and maybe turn it into something if they think that Hamas has the ability to control us in any way, shape, or form. And I think in that context, it won't be so easy for Hamas to come back. Demilitarized, a kind of collective sentiment that it can't come back in political control. So that's, I think, one thing is redefine that objective in a way that it makes sense from the standpoint ultimately of Israel's interests. But the question on the hostages is an important one. Initially, it was very clear that the former objective, focused exclusively on Hamas, was what was driving Israel. As time has gone by, the hostage families as a political voice is a very powerful one. It's the conscience of Israel. It touches everybody. Everyone knows that the state of Israel on October 7th fundamentally failed its citizens. And having failed them on October 7th, their overriding obligation is to get them out now. And that's affecting this Israeli government. We know from within the war cabinet, Gadi Eisenkot said there is not a military answer to getting the hostages released. There has to be a deal. We see talk of a deal right now, including possibly a 60-day pause. That's not the kind of thing you could have imagined that Prime Minister Netanyahu might have embraced at the beginning of the war. So it tells you the weight of the hostage issue. If you get a 60-day pause, a lot of other things can flow from that. But it can be tied, as I was saying, Israel has been succeeding in demilitarizing Gaza. That's a reality. Now you can build on that, and as we look to the future, the process needs to build on that as a premise, marry it to reconstruction, but based on a set of conditions.
All right, some quick kind of add-ons and use. I mean, to the question that you asked, and actually it was Miguel Moratinos who was the EU guy. First of all, I mean, I was smiling when you said it because I felt sorry for him, because when he was trying to write that document, both us on the Palestinian side and the Israelis were basically rewriting the negotiations to try to basically make ourselves look good and the other side look bad, and he had to take account into it. But really, I mean, in addition to what Dennis said, which is the politics, and it's all about the politics, that's why I keep on going back to this. Also, sometimes you can agree on 99% of the issues, but the 1% is the most difficult. Jerusalem, refugees, etc. And I think we sometimes dismiss how difficult these things are. And sometimes I believe that also some of these issues don't lend themselves to negotiation to start with. And we have to think more creatively of how to solve them. I mean, I remember on one in Taba, actually, being asked to negotiate with my Israeli counterpart a joint narrative of 1948. We couldn't agree, was it a good year or a bad year, let alone a joint narrative. You can't ignore it, but you can't negotiate it. What do you do with it? And I think we have to be creative in terms of how do we sensitize each society to the narrative of the other side without asking them to embrace that narrative. And there are ways, and there are precedents in terms of how you do this. In terms of the objectives, very quickly, just on the Hamas side of things, I think it was a mistake to define the objective as eliminating Hamas, simply because you can't. I mean, Hamas is an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, been part of the landscape since the 1920s. Many Arab governments tried to eradicate it. They're still with us. Yet, a more realistic and I think achievable objective is ensuring that this ideology does not pose a real threat, disarming it. At the end of the day, I might find an ideology abhorrent, but I can live with it if it doesn't have guns. And I think this would have been a much more achievable, much more realistic, and frankly, much more effective approach. But to the question about trust and what do you do? I mean, first of all, this is exactly why I believe this is not the time to start any major negotiation. And by the way, if I were a Palestinian, I would also ask, do I really negotiate with a government that has Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and whatnot? But that doesn't mean that there isn't stuff that you can do that actually will get us closer to the end game. Unfortunately, we've overlooked that this is an all or nothing, and when it's all or nothing, you end up with nothing. Yet there's space for certain positive things. If you look again, maybe I want to take a step back and diagnose. And look, we mentioned about the lack of faith and lack of hope. Look, my generation, if you are a Palestinian of my generation, you saw firsthand how cooperating with the Israelis produced good things for us. That was the 90s. It was not a very difficult sell. Today, if you're a Palestinian of your generation, if you've come of age in the year 2000 onwards, you've only seen the worst that Israel has to offer. Checkpoints, etc., whatnot. And so you don't really, you can think of it intellectually, but you can't internalize emotionally what it means to cooperate. And by the way, for the Israelis, they've only seen terror from the Palestinians, so it's kind of mutual. And you need to rehabilitate the idea of cooperation. And for example, one thing that's been going on below the radar for the last decade or so was security cooperation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And that created a bizarre constituency in Israel, almost counterintuitive. You talk to the Israeli military and intel folks, and they will tell you there's a lot that can be done on the ground. Now, that is not going to be transformative, not going to solve Jerusalem, refugees, but it can allow me to go to my Palestinian friends and say, look, working with the Israelis produces good things for us. Allows the Israelis to go and say, you have a reliable partner on the other side. So let's start focusing on this. Now, one last point, and it's a conceptual point. It's about trust. When I started the negotiations, young diplomat, I thought of negotiations as almost a flirtation leading to marriage. So you're flirting with someone, you want to know everything about them, agree on everything, your favorite pet, blah, 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 blah. So we ended up having negotiations about the nature of the future artistic cooperation between the two future states, etc. That ended up being a drag rather than a support to the negotiations. Today, I look at it as a divorce. Bad marriage, I hate you, you hate me, you've learned to hurt me, I've learned to hurt you. How do we separate? And when you do a divorce, you really go for the basics. What is it that I really need to do this separation? You get the kids, I get the TV, etc. But leave it at that. And then if you can become friends in the future, that's great. If not, it's better than what we have today. So we have to start thinking in a more reductionist, maybe reductionist is the wrong word, but in a more humble way. Let's look at the divorce. And by the way, it works sometimes. I look at Jordan, Israel, for example, or Egypt, Israel. I would challenge you to find more than a handful of Jordanians who like Israel. Both countries, not only do you have anti-Israel sentiment, we also have anti-Semitism that is there that's quite deep. Yet you had peace treaties that stuck, including during a Muslim Brotherhood presidency in Egypt. Why? Because there is a lot of interest, solid interest in maintaining it, a lot of cost for breaking it. Structure an agreement in this way, and doesn't mean that we don't have to work on coexistence. Personally, that's a lot of my career. But I think we should not have it as a condition, because I fear that then the perfect becomes the enemy of the good.
Thank you so much to both of our panelists today. This was really enlightening and strangely optimistic for this moment. And thanks to our audience and to SIPA for hosting us today.
Thank you. You want to
We can get a photo of you?
Sure.
Yeah. Sitting? Yeah. Standing?